A man who vanished without a trace 26 years ago knocked on a stranger's door in rural Indiana last year, carrying a wooden crate held shut with a rusted padlock. Inside were notebooks, burned circuit boards, and a folded note that made the woman who answered the door step back from her own doorway. His name was Daniel Kessler. The last time anyone had seen him alive was in 1997, the night he climbed into a machine he'd built in his barn and never came back out. When firefighters reached the property that night, the barn was already a smoking skeleton. On the concrete slab where the workbench had stood, they found a scorched circle almost 7 feet across, the surface fused smooth like glass. Copper wiring had melted straight into the floor. A steel support beam had warped into a shape that made the fire marshal stop and stare at it for a long moment before writing anything in his report. There was no body, no remains, no footprints leading away through the mud outside the door, no tire tracks on the gravel drive. The only thing anyone found was a note, folded twice, tucked inside a rusted toolbox that had somehow survived the heat. 6 words in pencil. It isn't about where you go. For over 2 decades, the official story was simple. Daniel Kessler died in an accidental fire, and whatever caused that scorch mark was something investigators quietly agreed not to speculate about out loud. The case went cold, the file got thinner every year it sat in a records room, and the story eventually drifted online into the kind of forums where unexplained disappearances get picked apart by strangers at 2 a.m. Then, last October, Daniel Kessler walked back into the world, older, thinner, carrying proof of something. And according to him, it was never a time machine at all. It was something considerably worse, and what happened to him during those missing years is the reason this story needs to start from the very beginning. Daniel didn't come out of a lab or a university program. He grew up on a farm outside a small town in southern Indiana, the kind of place where the nearest hardware store was 20 minutes away, and the nearest anything else was much farther. As a kid, he took apart every broken appliance his family owned, then started taking apart the ones that still worked. Radios, box fans, an old record player, a lawnmower engine he rebuilt 3 times before he turned 14. He wasn't destructive. He was trying to understand the language underneath the machines, the rules that made electricity behave the way it did, consistent and precise in a way that most of the rest of his life wasn't. By his late 20s, Daniel was living alone on a small piece of inherited land, working part-time at a feed store and spending every free hour in the barn he'd converted into a workshop. No degree, no funding, no one checking his math. Just years of self-taught electrical work, secondhand textbooks with cracked spines, and an instinct for electromagnetic fields that friends said bordered on eerie. He'd wire something together, flip a switch, and somehow know exactly what it was about to do before it did it. The thing that changed everything started as a simple demonstration piece, the kind of arc lamp setup you might see in a high school science classroom. 2 curved metal rods, high voltage running between them, a bright electric arc climbing up and breaking at the top before starting over at the bottom. One night, almost as an afterthought, Daniel picked up a cheap laser pointer he'd bought at a gas station and pointed the beam straight through the climbing arc, just to see what would happen. At first, nothing did. The arc kept climbing, the beam kept passing through it. The barn hummed with the low electrical drone it always made. Then the pitch of that hum shifted, tightened into something higher and more focused, like the whole system had locked onto a frequency it had never produced before. The arc stopped climbing and breaking in its normal rhythm. It pulled in on itself, steadied, and began turning in a slow spiral Daniel had never seen an arc do in his life. That's when he noticed the washer sitting on the workbench, just inside the edge of what he'd later start calling the field. For a fraction of a second, it wasn't there. Not moved, not knocked off the table by a vibration. Simply absent, and then simply present again, like a single frame had been cut out of a film reel and the rest spliced back together seamlessly. Daniel stood frozen for a long moment before he made himself breathe again. He started testing it with other small objects, screws, coins, a bent nail. Every so often, when the laser angle, the voltage, and the arc lined up in one exact configuration, an object would flicker out of existence for less than a second, and then return, sitting in precisely the same spot, as though nothing had happened at all. No flash, no sound. Just a small, silent absence where something solid used to be. And underneath the sharp smell of ozone that always came with high voltage, there was something else in the air, something Daniel couldn't name, cold and metallic in a way that made the hair on his arms rise for reasons that had nothing to do with static electricity. That was the night his life split cleanly into 2 halves, before the field and after it. In the winter of 1995, Daniel called into a late-night radio program called Night Signal, hosted by a man named Walter Graves, whose show had built a loyal following out of callers describing things that didn't have easy explanations. Strange lights, odd disappearances, machines that didn't behave the way machines were supposed to. Walter had a reputation for being skeptical, but fair, someone who let callers talk without either mocking them or feeding their fear. Daniel didn't sound like a man looking for attention. He sounded shaken, like someone trying to describe an experience he was still only halfway able to process himself. Walter asked the obvious questions. Could it be a trick of the light? Could the ionized air around the ark be distorting his vision? Daniel said he'd wondered the same thing until he started noticing how the room itself changed whenever the field activated. The air went heavy, almost pressurized, in a way that had nothing to do with heat or humidity. And then he mentioned his dog, an old hound that had slept in that barn its whole life and now refused to walk through the door, not just during an experiment, but ever, no matter how Daniel coaxed him. Birds stopped landing on the roof. Even the barn cats that used to hunt mice along the walls started avoiding the building entirely. Walter told him, plainly, to document everything. Video, written logs, exact voltage readings, and to bring in someone else, anyone else, to witness it independently before he went any further. Daniel didn't stop. He escalated. Over the following year, needing more power than his farmhouse's electrical service could supply, he rigged a connection to a set of decommissioned transformers he bought cheap from a salvage yard outside town, running a load through his property that dimmed the lights at his neighbor's place half a mile down the road. When the local utility co-op finally traced the irregular drawback to his barn, he was charged with unauthorized tampering with electrical equipment and spent 45 days in the county jail. For most people, that would have been the end of it. For Daniel, it became incubation time. He spent his whole sentence sketching circuit layouts on the backs of commissary forms, refining what he'd built in his head, thinking obsessively about what had gone wrong and what he'd change next. When he called Walter's show again after he got out, the change in his voice was immediate and unmistakable. He wasn't nervous anymore. He sounded focused in a way that had an edge to it, like a man who'd stopped weighing the risk because the pull of what he was chasing had become stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. He told Walter the objects weren't just flickering anymore. They were staying gone for seconds at a time, and when they came back, they weren't always quite the same. A wooden block vanished for nearly 3 full seconds and came back noticeably cold to the touch, colder than the room around it had any reason to make it. A cut flower disappeared and returned wilted, brittle. The stem dried out as if it had lost several days of moisture in the span of a few seconds. Whatever those seconds actually were for the object inside the field, they weren't the same seconds passing in the rest of the barn. Then came the part that made Walter go quiet on air for the first time in the show's history. Daniel had tested the field on a mouse, placed in a small wire cage set just inside its radius. The mouse vanished for 5 seconds. When it reappeared, it was alive, but wrong, spinning in tight, frantic circles, throwing itself against the sides of the cage, refusing food or water, showing a kind of disoriented panic Daniel said he'd never seen in an animal before. 2 days later, it died. Walter told him, as directly as he could, to stop immediately, to bring in people who actually understood the risk he was creating, not just for himself, but for anything alive that got near that field. There was a long pause on the line. Then Daniel said he couldn't stop. He was too close. And in a way neither of them understood yet, he was right, just not about what he thought he was close to. His final call to the show came in late February of 1997. He said the field had grown large enough that he could step partway into it himself. And when he did, time felt wrong around the edges. Everything outside the field seemed to slow down, sounds stretching and deepening, colors shifting subtly toward blue. When he stepped back out, more time had passed in the barn than he remembered experiencing inside the field. Minutes gone that he couldn't account for. Walter asked him outright if he thought he'd built a time machine. Daniel hesitated for a long time before answering that he didn't know anymore. Maybe it wasn't time at all. Maybe it was something about perception or about reality rearranging itself around that field in a way the word time didn't really capture. Walter tried once more to talk him back from the edge, but by then Daniel's caution had curdled into something closer to certainty. He said he thought people were watching the property. Cars he didn't recognize parked at the end of his road. He believed someone, somewhere, already knew what he was building. The call ended with a promise to check back in with video and full measurements. That call never came. In March of 1997, Daniel Kessler disappeared. His phone line went dead. Mail piled up unopened at the end of his driveway. Neighbors said the farmhouse looked abandoned within a couple of weeks. Then the barn burned, and investigators found exactly what would later become the whole shape of the story. The melted wiring, the warped steel, the scorched circle on the concrete, and no trace of a person anywhere in the wreckage. Just the toolbox, and the 6 words folded inside it. The case went cold and stayed that way for years, drifting slowly into the strange corner of the internet where unexplained disappearances get discussed by people who've never met each other but somehow all know the same details by heart. In 2003, someone found an old photograph from a 1931 newspaper archive showing an unidentified man who'd washed up on an Oregon beach, wearing clothing that looked strangely modern for the era, with a small rectangular device in his coat pocket that nobody at the time could identify. Online, people noticed the resemblance to descriptions of Daniel's face and started asking an impossible question. Had he gone backward instead of forward and died decades before he was even born? There was no real evidence behind it, just a grainy photograph and a story already hungry for more shadows to attach itself to. Then, in the fall of 2011, a physicist named Dr. Elena Marsh, who taught at a small university in Colorado and had a quiet side interest in unconventional electromagnetic research, opened an email one morning that made her sit very still at her desk. The sender name read Daniel Kessler. The message was short. He said people believed he was dead, and that wasn't quite right, but he also wasn't sure alive was the correct word for whatever he currently was. Attached were diagrams for something he called a third-stage resonance frame, along with an explicit warning not to build it, only to study it from a distance. The attachments were far more advanced than anything Daniel had ever described on the radio. Full field equations, warnings about cumulative biological effects from repeated exposure, and detailed notes on neurological symptoms that matched exactly what had happened to that mouse years earlier, just described now in language far more precise than anything the barn experimenter from 1997 would have known. Dr. Marsh tried to reply. The email bounced immediately. She eventually traced the original message to a public library computer terminal in a small town in New Mexico. Nobody working there remembered anyone matching his description. Another dead end, another fragment, from a man who seemed to exist only in scattered, unconnected pieces. 11 years after that, in October of last year, a couple named Robert and Sarah Whitfield were renovating an old farmhouse they'd bought outside a small town in rural Indiana. While pulling insulation out of the attic walls, Sarah's hand hit something solid behind the framing, a wooden crate, heavy and thick with dust, clearly hidden, somewhere no one would stumble onto it by accident. A faded label was fixed to the lid in handwriting gone soft with age, D. Kessler. Do not open until it's time. Inside were journals full of notes, diagrams, dates, and warnings spanning from 1995 all the way to 2022, 27 years of documentation. Circuit boards wrapped carefully in anti-static bags, and a single photograph showing a man standing next to a large ring-shaped metal frame in what looked like a basement workshop, dated June of 2020. On the back, in the same handwriting as the crate's label, it worked, but not the way I thought it would. Then they found something that unsettled them even more than the photograph. One of the journals contained the exact street address of the farmhouse they'd just bought, along with a short note beside it. Field conditions. Stable here. Safe storage. They'll find it at the right time. They posted about the discovery online, and the story spread within days. People who'd followed the old night signal broadcasts for decades started reaching out. 3 weeks later, Robert's phone rang from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was older, worn thin, but unmistakable to anyone who'd heard those old recordings. The man said his name was Daniel Kessler, that he'd heard they found his crate, and asked if he could come explain what had actually happened to him. He arrived at the Whitfield farmhouse on a cold evening in late October, physically around the age he should have been if the last 26 years had passed for him normally. But he looked older than that, in a way that had nothing to do with wrinkles or gray hair, worn down in some deeper sense, as if something essential had been slowly drained out of him over the years, without leaving a visible wound behind. Over several hours at the kitchen table, he told them what he said had really happened, and it wasn't time travel at all. It was something stranger and far more disturbing. He said the machine hadn't sent him backward or forward through time. It had desynchronized him, his word for it. He said he'd stayed in the same world, the same town, the same sequence of events as everyone else, just slightly out of phase, like a radio tuned a hair off the correct station. The signal technically there, but always distant and hard to hold on to clearly. He described the night of the fire. The machine had finally stabilized, the field holding steady for the first time instead of flickering. In a moment of reckless certainty, he stepped fully inside it. There was no flash of light, no sensation of movement through time, only a strange, sinking quiet, as if the world had shifted slightly to one side and left him standing in the space it used to occupy. When he stepped back out, hours had passed that he had no memory of living through. The overloaded machine had caught fire behind him. He escaped through a gap in the back wall before the structure came down, but when he tried to return to his ordinary life afterward, everything about it had quietly come apart. People recognized his face, but couldn't place his name. His old landlord remembered renting to someone, but couldn't connect that memory to Daniel specifically. Phone calls failed to go through. Paperwork he needed kept mysteriously falling apart in other people's hands. Conversations slipped out of people's minds almost as fast as they happened, people responding to him normally in the moment, and then forgetting the entire exchange within hours. He told the Whitfields he hadn't vanished from the world. He'd become difficult to perceive, difficult to hold on to in memory, as though other minds could register his presence in real time, but couldn't encode it into anything lasting. Visible, but unretainable. Present, but somehow impermanent. A face that dissolved the instant you looked away from it. He drifted at the edges of everyday life for the next 2.5 decades. Cash jobs, short-term rooms, places where nobody needed a name that would stick. He kept studying what had happened to him, kept trying to understand and maybe reverse it. and every time he exposed himself to a rebuilt version of the machine, the condition deepened. He became a little harder to remember with each attempt, a little easier for the world to let slip through its fingers. He eventually came to believe the machine had never touched time at all. It had touched perception, memory, the fragile mechanism by which one conscious mind confirms that another person exists and matters. A person, he told the Whitfields, isn't only a body walking around. A person is also a pattern held inside other people's minds, a web of memories and recognitions that quietly insists, this person was here, this person is real. He believed the machine had damaged his ability to generate and hold that pattern in anyone else's mind, even while his physical presence remained completely intact. When the Whitfields asked why he'd finally decided to come forward now, he said he was running out of time, not the ordinary kind, but the kind measured in how long anyone could still remember him at all. He believed he was approaching a point where he'd become completely unholdable, present but impossible for another mind to retain, a person still moving through the world, while the world quietly, continuously forgot he was in it. Before he left, he asked them for 3 things. Send the journals to a private archive, seal off the section of the attic where he'd hidden a small piece of equipment that he said was still magnetically active, and never try to reach him again. Then he stood, walked out the front door, and disappeared into the dark. This is the part Robert and Sarah still say they can't fully explain. The moment Daniel left the house, they had to concentrate just to hold onto his face. Not the next day, immediately. The color of his jacket, the shape of his hands, the exact sound of his voice all began slipping away like water through open fingers. Sarah grabbed a notepad and started writing as fast as she could, because she could feel the memory dissolving in real time, not the way ordinary memories fade slowly over months, but actively, as though something were pulling the information back out of her mind while she was still trying to hold on to it. Robert stood in the kitchen, trying to recall the sound of the man's voice less than an hour after hearing it, and simply couldn't. He remembered that words had been spoken. He remembered roughly what they'd meant. But the actual sensory experience of hearing them was already gone, replaced by something that felt more like reading a summary than remembering an event. Within a week, they needed their own handwritten notes just to reconstruct what had happened that night at all. Without them, they wouldn't have been able to say with any real confidence that anyone had visited their kitchen. Today, they describe the whole encounter as something closer to a half-remembered film than a lived experience. They know it happened because the evidence is still sitting in front of them. The journals, the photograph, the circuit boards, their own handwriting on their own notepad. But the actual felt experience of sitting across the table from Daniel Kessler, listening to him speak, looking at his face, has almost entirely dissolved. Since then, there have been only scattered, unverified sightings. A man matching his general description, asking unusual questions outside a university physics building. A stranger at a small technical conference who introduced himself politely and whom nobody could clearly describe an hour later. A shelter resident with an oddly advanced understanding of electromagnetic theory who left before anyone learned much about him at all. Each sighting less certain than the last, each witness less confident in what they actually saw, not because Daniel is hiding especially well, but because if his own account is true, the world itself may no longer be able to hold on to him clearly enough for anyone to be sure of anything. Somewhere out there, Daniel Kessler may still be walking through ordinary streets, standing in ordinary rooms, passing through the edges of other people's lives without ever fully landing in their memory, still trying to leave behind enough evidence before the last thread finally gives way, and even the evidence stops being enough to prove he was ever here at all. The machine worked, just not the way he expected. It didn't hand him the past or the future. It took away the one thing almost nothing can survive losing, the simple, quiet ability to remain real inside the minds of the people around him. Whether Daniel Kessler is still out there somewhere, drifting through towns and conversations that slip out of memory as soon as they end, or whether the story itself has simply become one more thing this world is slowly forgetting, nobody can say for certain anymore. The journals remain locked away in that private archive, still unopened by anyone outside a small circle of researchers who agreed never to discuss what's inside them publicly. The attic in that Indiana farmhouse stays sealed exactly as he asked. And every so often, someone somewhere reports a brief, strange encounter with a man who seems to know far too much about electromagnetic fields for a stranger passing through, an encounter that always fades a little faster from memory than it should, leaving behind only a faint, uneasy feeling that something important just happened and already can't be fully recalled.